Good morning. Welcome to our last and most special, I would say, event of 2025 from the IFPH Explorers. On behalf of the International Federation for Public History, I welcome you today. Today we have a panel. We're going to talk about comics, how their narratives and their drawing can help or aid or complement public history. I am not this time, since it's the last one of the year, I'm not going to introduce you to the participants. They're going to do it themselves. Then we're going to do some questions. And I also welcome the participants in the audience. If you want to ask them questions, just jump ahead or write them in the chat so I can read it to them. So welcome, Walter Grison. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And thank you, Amy Wright, for being here. Also, thank you for accepting our invitation. The floor is all yours.
Amy, do you want to go first?
So I have a few slides to just sort of introduce myself and my work. So I'm just going to share screen and pull those up and talk a little bit. Sorry, Jimena, can you just
I think
co-host?
I did.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Okay. A lot of technical difficulties. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Yep. My name is Amy Wright. So I am a PhD candidate in public history at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. We are actually the first public history PhD program in Canada. Obviously, there's been other PhD programs and public history elsewhere in the world, but we are the first in Canada. A lot of my background is I was a public librarian for more than a decade at many institutions, including the New York Public Library, and a lot of my experience with public history and also the work I do now is very much influenced by my work with public libraries, but also my work as a comic festival organizer. So I am the current executive director of the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. And I have previously worked with the American Library Association Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, organizing professional development for educators and librarians at San Diego Comic-Con, New York Comic Con, and other shows. And part time, I am a contract instructor in the Department of History at Carleton and also the Department of Library and Information Science at McGill University. So, two of the sort of ways that I use comics and memory in my work sort of has two different facets. The first is very much focused on public history and the classroom as a really important sphere of public history. So I do teach a public history class at Carleton, which is history through comic books. And this is offered as a public history class to undergrads. It's an open class, so we do get some history majors, but also students from other faculties. And this class is very much about thinking through history, but through comics. So we do a little bit of everything, but primarily focus on 20th century history and really trying to resituate comics as historical documents, as historical representations, but also as important ways of understanding history and also creating history also from the student's perspective. So we talk a lot about zines, indie comics, and the way that those reflect lived experiences, not traditionally on the shelf on most history bookshelves. But then the other facet of my work, and primarily the focus of my PhD research, is re-examining, you may be familiar, of course, especially with this audience, Dr. Frederick Wertham, of course, author of Seduction of the Innocent. Many people are quite familiar with him. What they may not be as familiar with is the fact that comic censorship happened in other parts of the world, including Canada. In fact, it happened earlier in Canada. So Canada had Senate hearings on the sale and distribution of salacious and indecent literature before the US did. There was also comics were added to the criminal code in Canada. And importantly, unfortunately for myself, librarians and educators were actually not always advocates of comics. In many cases, they were actually quite crucial figures in terms of the anti-comics movement. And so a lot of my research also focuses on when we talk about memory and also understandings of history and the intellectual history of reading, what kind of impact does that have when we have people who are very prominent in library and education circles actually working in the anti-comics movement in the 1950s and 60s? And so that's just a little bit about me and my research, and I'm happy to turn it over to you, Walter.
Tremendous honor to be here with you, Amy and Jimena. I've been catching up and learning about the International Federation for Public History, and the work is spectacular. So thank you for making this forum happen and giving us an opportunity to have this conversation. There's a lot of stuff to lay out background for me. Um, I a DeWitt Wallace Endowed Chair in History at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. I spent most of my career, the last 20 years, on the tenure track, doing very traditional kind of urban studies, history, analyzing place, space, and time, particularly patterns of racial segregation in national and international context. But there was an unusual event that happened in the midst of all that. I had spent a lot of time as a hobby writing short fiction and developing comics. And so those things came together in 2016 when the Black Panther from Marvel Comics showed up in the movie Captain America Civil War. And so I had spent about 7 years working with Christopher Priest and Reginald Hudlin, who were the writers of the Black Panther comic, that were dreaming that one day there would be a Black Panther movie. And so I posted for their forum a thread called Culture of Wakanda. And it became an online encyclopedia for the writers and artists that they began using elements from the thread to shape the Black Panther story. And so in 2016, when the character showed up in the film, I wrote up all the resources as a single online post for the African American Intellectual History Society. This became known as the Wakanda Syllabus. The Wakanda Syllabus then shaped a lot of what Ryan Coogler and Hannah Beachler and Ruth Carter put together for the actual Black Panther film that was released in February of 2018. And so over 15 years of work putting that all together. And that's where I wanted to start to kind of share the brief PowerPoint we were asked for our biographical background. Um, so hopefully everybody can see the share. Um, So there's just me, old picture by an amazing photographer, artist, digital designer named Rupa Dasgupta, who had also done a ton of work for Marvel Comics back in the day. This was when I was the dean of the honors school back at Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey. But it was the work of the Wakanda syllabus and also the creation of the Timothy Thomas Fortune Cultural Center that happened in 2018, 2019 that really launched me into this role here at Macalester. That now my work is largely about using elements of fiction to shape public policy. How do we dream of better worlds in literature and art and music? And then what do we do to actually create those visions using architecture, urban planning, the different kinds of design principles that we teach as we build, literally remake the society around ourselves. So that's what I do here in Minnesota, but I have projects, over 2,000 projects in the United States. Growing out, I have several dozen outside of the US. And so this is what I spend most of my time doing is giving these kinds of skills and talks. My favorite piece of this is that in the Wakanda syllabus, in the design that we put together, one of the things that emerged after a couple of years of discussion was, so why is the Black Panther never figured out where that meteorite came from? This vibranium became the heart of the culture, but obviously it came from someplace. And so we started exploring the ideas of Black Panther in outer space. And eventually this became the next frontier. I think probably right around the film's launch, they in the comics introduced the idea of the intergalactic empire of Wakanda. So it was no longer just a single South Central African country. It was now this five galaxy system of planets that just had a much broader template of potential narratives. And that was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so back in '03, Marvel formally named me a Wakandan ambassador. And in 2016, 2018, right before the film came out, I was named the architect of Wakanda. And so all of these stories built out and kind of were a reflection of the way I approached history and urban design. Now we're calling it Afrofuturist design because the Black Panther made the stories so popular that people became much more interested in the idea of Afrofuturism. And so the last part of the introduction is that in 2022, I was working with the New York City Department of Education, particularly the Civics for All social studies group. And I had been writing a lot of pieces for them. They were doing comics and posters about historic figures in the African diaspora. And in doing that work, they came to me in December 22 and said, could we do a graphic novel or a comic about the history of hip hop? And so the history of hip hop is something I've been teaching since 1994. I knew a really talented artist, Tim Fielder, who has been doing Afrofuturist art of all kinds, for 40 years. And so I called him up in December. He said yes. And over the course of about 7 months, we designed the graphic history of hip hop that started as a 24-page comic that was given for free to 100,000 students in the city schools. Um, as a result, there was enormous celebration. Students literally stampeded us in one middle school and demanded that we do more. And so we expanded the 24-page comic to a 90-page graphic novel that is right there. And so that not graphic novel took off, and in the first month got over 4 billion interactions online. People just swarmed it. It was the number one bestseller on Amazon from April of 2024 until like July of 2024. And it's been nonstop. As much as Wakanda just changed my life back in 2018, graphic history continues to just grow exponentially every day. And so now where there were dozens of graphic nonfiction products, now there are thousands. It's just spanned out into all these other fields: graphic science, graphic medicine, economics. And so the most recent thing was at New York City Comic Con. Marvel announced a new formal partnership with Mass Appeal, which is the company led by Nasir Jones, legendary, arguably greatest MC of all time. And they put out a comic called Legend Has It, where they literally rendered 9 legendary MCs as superheroes and told a story about their adventures together. And so the graphic history of hip hop continues to just spin out all kinds of new products. But for me, all of this starts with, and this is a tricky one, the Holy Bible, Dignity and Divinity, was the first experiment I made with this, taking a historic text and then rendering parts of it as graphic art. And so this came out in 2013. Again, was a bestseller, independent comic bestseller for about 6 months. But it tells, I think, 6 or 7 famous stories of the Bible. But instead of focusing on the traditional telling, we rendered it where the women were the folks who were essentially the protagonists of the story. And so in the Garden of Eden, it's Adam who brings the apple to Eve. Um, in the story of Moses, we in fact find Nefertiti as the one who rises to challenge Pharaoh, or Zipporah, my fault, challenges Pharaoh Nefertiti. Um, the story of David instead becomes the uh, story of Bathsheba and her killing David's wife in order to seduce him. But the one that got the most attention was, of course, the story of the Savior's birth, where we said instead of Mary having a son, Mary had a daughter. And so this is the story of Isis in place of Jesus. And so that generated enormous outcry for blasphemy. And so folks were outraged but wanted to see the story. And so we managed to do 2 or 3 of those that we were very happy with. But yeah, that's where I started playing with this idea of historic text and then cultural resonance ultimately at the core of it. and how do we actually put together these ideas and bring more people to understand the written word in whatever discipline, but also challenge them to kind of internalize their ideas, visualize them. And I guess that's my closing point, is that I did a lot of work in media ecology during this period. And so what it came down to was neuroscience, is that we have to teach people to read. We all know this, whatever language. We see very instinctively. After a few weeks beyond birth, we begin to process visual input. And so the neurology of sight is much deeper and more impactful than the neurology of reading. And so I began to play with this, also the neurology of listening, and discovered that when I combined active visual media with the written word and with a musical or a listening experience, the learning was much deeper. And so this became the transformative core of my pedagogy, is that I was always stimulating the academic experience using multiple forms of media. And so since I did the Wakanda syllabus, I've been playing a lot with taste and sound as part of this, but to create an immersive set of experiences. And so I do this now with any number. My student just created a Roblox platform that teaches history of Minnesota. And so using immersive technology to supplement and expand on what we can do with writing, that's been one of the key pieces of my work. So thank you for letting me ramble on for a little bit.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Walter, for your presentations. Before we go on, I just want to make a clarification. Our third participant, Maria Elena Bedoya, she's located in Spain, had a last-minute inconvenience. She sends her regards, and she's very sorry for not being here. And also, we are going to miss her, but we are going to continue with Amy and Walter anyway. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have some questions ready for the participants, but if somebody in the audience wants to just jump in and make a question, please be my guest. So I have a very first. I'm thinking about our audience and some of the students that are going to watch this. So my first question is can be a little bit basic, but I think useful anyway. What kinds of sources or archives do you use? How do you translate them into a narrative form? So I don't know who wants to go first.
Okay, I'll kick it off. I mean, I actually think that's a great question to kick it off because I think one thing that maybe we didn't talk about enough when we started this is that for as much as we're having larger discussions about visual history and comics and history, Walter and I met, at the American Historical Association this past January, and those of us who work with comics and history generally all know each other or we're 1 or 2 degrees separated because still there's only a handful of us. So I think this is a really important discussion for larger discussions of history and like what we use as resources and archival material, because I think coming into the classroom, students tend to have a very limited view of what that might be. We see a disproportionate amount, of course, of Mouse and Persepolis are great texts, but I think when you talk about like comics and history, those are such the default, and it overlooks the fact um, that there is such a long history of comics being used for various purposes, visual narrative being used throughout history. So when I'm teaching the course, one of the biggest things I try to do is basically I use the course as less of an introduction to comics and more of an introduction to visual history, and really talk about the fact that there is such a long lineage of visual history in history. One of the things that is really impactful, I found with the students, is sort of resituating the fact that comic books were especially very popular in the Second World War. I talk about the fact that we know that the US government, was buying periodicals and magazines for soldiers, including copies of Captain America. And there's sort of a bit of incredulity for students. And then I will follow that up by showing resources from, because I'm based in Ottawa, showing resources from the Canadian War Museum, which has an extensive collection of comic books published not only just for soldiers, but also published for the general public in and around the World War II era. I mean, I've even seen a comic book published by the Canadian government, which is an anti-communist comic book, but they also thought that comic books would somehow spread communism. So it's an interesting thing. Like they're choosing a very effective medium, but Um, so I really try to expose the fact that it's not just mouse and Persepolis, that this is actually a very long trajectory. And then, of course, as part of the material, they do read some of the more common, like mouse and Persepolis, but I really try to highlight a lot of Canadian content, but also really talk about digital publishing or also the history of zine making and like self-published work and this idea of communities writing their own experiences. So in a Canadian context, we do read excerpts from Chester Brown's Louis Riel, which is one of the most famous, nonfiction Canadian graphic works. It is, of course, not written by somebody who is Métis or with particular, and it came out in a particular time and place. So we juxtapose that with excerpts from This Place 150 Years Retold, which is different chapters in Canadian history, all by Indigenous creators using actually really different primary sources. So there's a chapter all about Louis Riel, which is actually using primary sources from the Métis archives in Manitoba. So I try to use a varied sources in terms of the comics. And then sort of the last thing that I do to, again, really situate this within the historical record is use a lot of primary sources. So I'm working with primary sources from Library of Congress. This is where Frederick Wortham's collection is. I have primary sources from Library and Archives Canada and also larger institutional repositories like the New York Public Library to really talk about the fact that there was this sort of widespread fear around children's reading, but also how these misperceptions around reading and like what Walter was talking about, even these ideas of like what is sort of good reading or like how people resonate with things. Because there was an idea that comic books were somehow harmful to children's reading. And it was never actually true, but it kind of got perpetuated. And I think what's important to talk about in a historical context is when these books are pulled from the shelf or when this format is vilified, what stories are we erasing from the record? What stories are we never allowing to actually become part of the historical record? And that's something I talk to the students about, especially within a Canadian context. We have a call to action under the Truth and Reconciliation Committee to understand that history is not official records. History is not necessarily what we know to be true. It's the stories that haven't made it onto the shelf, the oral testimonies, the lived experiences. And so I really try to get them thinking a little bit more broadly about visual history and this idea of what happens when we're perceiving only certain formats and stories as somehow being worthy of history.
Walter, please go ahead. And after that, I have a question from Neil Parek. I hope I'm saying your last name correct. I will read it in a moment.
All good. So archives, that's a really long answer on my side. So I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. Um, I have to give credit up front to the Paley Urban Archives that are located in Philadelphia. That was my training ground along with the Charles Blockson collection of rare books from African American history that's also located at Temple University. Really, the Philadelphia set of historical archives, probably the largest being the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, absolutely a treasure. Um, but from there, that was 30 years ago. I started using all of those materials. And so certainly the New York City Public Library, the Schomburg collection in Harlem, um, gosh, started working through Columbia and did a lot of stuff with archives in Western Europe, um, things through Oxford and Cambridge. Dear Lord, it's just an unending list. And so many archives, I think transformative for me in world economic history, located in Mexico City or in Toronto. I think it was Ryerson University in Toronto introduced me to media ecology some 15 years ago. And so this was Marshall McLuhan and what is the book? Amusing Ourselves to Death, um, Neil Postman. These collections of rare documents are just absolute treasures. I'm not even touching on Library of Congress. These like here that I'm in Minnesota, the University of Minnesota, down into the University of Chicago. one of the challenges I have to teach my students is that they have to begin with an archive, but then once they know to start looking for archives, they are just overwhelmed by the tidal wave of available material. And so beginning to discern what things they can use and how they can use them becomes the next challenge. So then we start to get into disciplinary method and then interdisciplinary methods. But my goodness, for this material in particular, of course, I'll say I started reading Marvel comics when I was about 4 years old. And so I think I read my first DC comic by the time I was 6. And those experiences, those stories still live in my mind in really visceral ways. So I always loved to read, but the way I came to read was through comics and the kind of patterns of knowledge that were formed. In a very similar way, maybe 5 or 6 years later, I began to really be serious about hip hop as a listener. And that experience also shaped the way I constructed knowledge and kind of the what would become the archive of material that I use as an academic professional is that that art and that music shaped the pathways by which I organized my understanding of history. And so, yeah, those are the things where I look at, Marcy Leanna Morgan's work at Harvard, where she created a formal hip hop digital archive. Like those songs, those performances are in my brain and in my eyes in ways that when I go to the archive, it's like going home. And so to do a project like Graphic History of Hip Hop, I can make references and there are enormous body of literature cited in the book, but the archive itself kind of lives in my body. And that's what strengths and makes the craft of the art and the text really work well together. Is that there's a sense of my experience on every page that when it stitches together is quite striking for anybody who has not looked at hip hop before, but especially for people who have a similar experience of how hip hop shaped them. And that has been the resonance. That has been the way people come to it is I think that group of middle schoolers who initially wanted much more, what triggered that for them was the fact that the school district in the comic had removed Kanye West. And so they were like, no, Kanye is too controversial, is too poisonous. We're not going to introduce this into our school system, which is a completely rational and understandable decision. But the students reacted immediately and were like, why is this piece of what I know not here? Everything else I know and I appreciate and value is here. Why is this piece missing? And so that kind of energy is something I sought my whole career as an educator, is what drives people to react and stand up and demand more out of their educational experience, out of the research that they hope to perform. Um, I feel constantly honored by the fact that people take that kind of energy from these projects, and that's why I'm so determined to make more of them.
Thank you. Thank you, Amy and Walter. So we're going to go with a question from Neil. He says, Amy talked about the official criticism of comics in Canada at the government level. So for Amy and Walter, is there a similar history in the US? What is better or worse for comics in the US?
I mean, the US is very famous, of course, for the introduction of the Comics Code Authority following the 1954 Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency in comic books. So basically, you have the industry self-censoring mechanisms that are introduced amongst comic books. So, the comic book industry survives, but it survives in a very altered way. But I think one thing that gets overlooked is you have similar things happening all around the world. So the UK in 1955 publishes the Harmful Publications Act, and this is specifically targeting what they deemed horror comics. And I think something that's important to point out that I know gets minimized, I think even in modern conceptions of what happened, is that in Canada, they're called crime comics. They talk about crime comics or horror comics in the US, but generally they say just comic books. UK and Australia, there's a lot of discussion of horror comics. It was basically anything that they deemed to be objectionable. And this is where we get into this whole thing that we're also wrestling with in the present uptick in censorship of like what somebody deems objectionable or worthy of being on the shelf is so relative. And what was happening all throughout is you have, various countries passing legislation. There was even the UN had conference on an international scale in the early 1950s talking about impacts of media. So again, there was fears around television and radio as well, but there was a very focused, controlled fear and worry about comic books. And so this is sort of the formal things that happen. But one of the things my research is really looking at is we would call this a moral panic, what happened in the 1950s. And what happens when you have a moral panic? A lot of times, what is sort of untalked about is how that lingers. Even Walter, what you're talking about with music. I mean, there have been so many moral panics around music. In fact, like the whole term moral panic, originates with this idea of the mod rockers in the UK. And but then we have like Stuart Hall and the Birmingham School look at like the moral panic even around violence and young black men in the UK under like the era of Maggie Thatcher. And so the point is, even after a moral panic subsides, what happens in the decades that follow? And I mean, some of my research looks at the fact that even after these formal restrictions have maybe passed, a lot of times, and we all have dealt with this in our professional practice, people think that comics are somehow still less than. We hear a lot of discussion about them being stepping stones for reading. In a historical context, a lot of times people will say, I'm going to give a kid a comic book as a way to start to understand something, overlooking the fact that because comics are multimodal, they are actually working for all readers. They can actually have these very complex ideas around trauma and memory and history. So, yeah, there's formal restrictions all over the world in the 1950s, but there's a lot of a stigma around the reading that persists to present.
Walter, would you like to add something to the
So I was looking at
list?
Neil's question, and I want to make sure I kind of stay focused there. Um, let's see. There's similar history in the U.S. Yeah, the Frederick Wortham stuff. You can't do anything in comic studies and not come across Seduction of the Innocent. And I will say that also does make an appearance in the Wakanda syllabus because um, Christopher Priest, for being the first African American writer editor at Marvel Comics, um, is a deep intellectual, and he is quite humble as a Baptist minister about the creativity and the kind of depth of thought he puts into his work. But his third major Black Panther story was titled Seduction of the Innocent. And it was a provocative story about the way, frankly, the devil, Mephisto, would use deception to attempt to corrupt someone like the Black Panther, which is a kind of classic story in Marvel about the devil trying to destroy a protagonist through forcing them into a moral conflict. Um, but that piece was about drug addiction. It was about kind of inappropriate contact with young women, things that are still in our headlines quite prominently around Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. And so this piece is not just about kind of the moral panic in a particular context. Um, it's about the kind of effort of authority to suppress human expression and then to determine what's legitimate or what's illegitimate as part of our human experience. And that's the piece where comics start to get condemned, is that people feel like the ability to produce writing and art together is too democratic. It's too available to too many. And so, this has clearly horrific outcomes. I mean, I was just watching a piece last night, was the what is this documentary, but dramatic reenactment of the life of Jeffrey Dahmer. And he talked about seeing in that story a comic about Ed Gein. And so that is clearly a piece where we need to pay attention to what young people consume and to take seriously the impacts it can have on them. At the same time, to just paint with a broad brush and attempt to eliminate texts that give us new knowledge or challenge us to think in new ways. Um, that's always been the danger of the censorship, of the impulse to silence. And that's something I think very much at a national, international level we're struggling with, is what is acceptable discourse? And how do we confront the expression that we find troublesome? And that's something I think we can talk about much more. It's not just like US, UK, English speaking world. Some of the most exciting things I've seen in graphic history are coming out of the discussion of African history. And so those stories really opened the door for the Academy to say, okay, what are we missing? What can we learn that we're not learning in these bodies of traditional writing and knowledge?
Thank you, Walter and Amy. I have another question now that you have mentioned like songs and movies and other things. What do you think comics make possible in terms of historical memory that other forms such as film, archival work, or written history cannot achieve in the same way?
You turned the table on me. All right. So I just put the New York Hidden Voices archive in the chat. Oh, I actually just sent that to one person. I need to make sure I update that. So no, like what's possible? Wow. Um, a lot. The basic thing I would say, ah, there's so much here that I'm trying to make sure I stay on top of. Um, yeah, other forms. It takes time. Um, okay, so I'll say it like this. When we think about our public library, it is extraordinarily different than what we would even see in most high school libraries or certainly community college or university libraries, right? So just teaching my students the distinctions between li archives and libraries is a huge lesson. And then within that, and Amy is infinitely more qualified than me to speak to this, how we use those structures of information sorting and the discernment of the information and how it's organized. I had to take a huge turn a decade ago when I saw the growth of digital media to say, oh no, this is not good. We're not using any categorization standards to help people sort through and find the available data more effectively. And that's still a huge problem. It's more of a problem now because of large language models and these kinds of web crawlers that have no discernment about the way that they aggregate information. And so when I talk about what's possible in comics, it lets us stitch things together in a way that's more carefully curated. And I think a lot about my dear colleague Julian Chambliss at Michigan State, who runs the Comic Studies Society and puts together just amazing work every year that's combining literature and history and using graphic art to help us understand our world in more depth. Um, so folks that don't know Michigan State and Julian Chambliss, please go take a look. This piece about comics, because they synthesize so much data and help us play into the strengths that we have as human beings to process different kinds of data, they let us not just learn and retain information, they help us process and ask better questions and find more complicated answers faster. And by the way that we go and engage in that process, instead of having to go and complete high school and complete college and then get an advanced degree to get to the place that you access an archive and then begin to learn how within the discipline the existing discourse has shaped knowledge, you can jump that process a lot faster and do advanced work in middle school or high school because you're going to have access to better info and more of it and better ways to organize it that people in middle school or high school couldn't have dreamt of 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, like I said, it's a little complicated, but that's been my experience anyway, is that using comics lets us get to more complicated answers and better questions and utilize structures of information that we've created much more efficiently. Now, Amy, follow that.
No, no, I think that's so much of that. I mean, one of the things, I talk to my students about, I know a lot of people within comics do, is you get on an airplane and how are you relaying complicated and very important information to a whole plane of passengers? You're using a comic, and I would say some of the emergency manuals are more successful than others. And I actually have the student even compare what are good in some models depending on the airline or whatever. But I think for me, some of the most, there's a few things. One of the most, I think, exciting advances, especially in the past few decades, is a lot of the research coming out of the graphic medicine community, really looking at sort of the neuroscience of what happens when we read comics. And, we've always known that reading is very vital towards developing empathy. But I think especially adding the visual element, you have some really compelling research, and I'm going to drop it into the chat. One particular peer-reviewed paper looking at patient-centered care and using comics because so much of course, what's invisible, mental health, a lot of the way people physically experience illness, symptoms, this is not something that is readily, we're using language, which is sort of like a poor way of trying to, in a very static way, sometimes describe what might be happening all at once. A lot of people talk about the idea of symptoms. You might be feeling one way, but also there might be pain at the same time. So you're basically trying to describe something that's happening all at once, like a bit of a time knot. And how do you relay that in sequential language? Where adding the elements of comics give you that extra layer, which is art has always provided, of really capturing multiple depths, but also this sort of emotional depth of feeling of what's going on. One of my favorite runs of Captain America is the Winter Soldier run, done by Ed Brubaker, in which we have Bucky talking, like working through his experiences of PTSD. And I mean, there's one particular scene that I show students, which is him, on his knees, and there's all of these different memories from the past existing in one place. And so I think that's an important element of comics as well. So you have this emotional thing, but also there's a great video Jean Lewin Yang did when he was National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at Library of Congress. And he talks about how comics are not time-based. As the reader, we're sort of controlling the pace at which we're consuming the information, but we can come back and look at those over and over again. And it also allows any of the creators to sort of have on one page multiple different time periods existing, which is a better way, not a perfect way, but a better way of capturing the fact that we're all sort of living in multiple time periods in terms of our memories and our experiences, especially I think the idea of trauma and historical memory, that you might be walking through something very mundane, but your head is somewhere else. Your head is like replaying something that you've lived through, replaying future worries. And how do you sort of relate that to somebody outside of yourself? Or if you have a comic panel in which, somebody can see a little bit of what's happening inside your head, it is that sort of better way of sharing these experiences, these unknowable experiences. So I think there's been, of course, a lot coming out with Holocaust and genocide studies, certainly starting with a lot of the attention around Maus, but certainly not ending, that there's been such a rich tradition of people relaying the really hard stuff using visual formats because art is a way of capturing those really hard things. So I think, yeah, through graphic medicine, through a lot of the graphic histories we're seeing around traumatic violence and trauma. It's really these great potentials for how we're creating, also, if you will, an emotional record of history that we often don't talk about enough.
Thank you, Amy and Walter, and that gives me like the perfect segue for the next question. Since you're talking about historical memory and trauma, PTSD, and those things, how do you, in your own work, or if you know about it, do you approach the participation of people or communities directly involved in the events? Sometimes, I mean, I'm not expert in comics, but I teach historical memory, and I know that sometimes it's very hard to approach the people who have been touched by traumatic events. So what's your take on this?
I'll jump first for that, Joy. Um, so my base skill set comes from oral history, having to do interviews with folks who have suffered enormous pain. And I'll tell one story I don't tell very often. It's about the first article I ever published. It's Olivia Stewart Henry. She is the first Black woman to be named pastor of a Black church. in the AME, African Methodist Episcopal denomination. And so a huge, huge struggle. It's almost 200 years getting to the place where a woman was officially named pastor. And so I got to meet her. Had to work for more than 2 months to convince her to sit down for an actual formal interview. Um, Went through a pretty miraculous faith healing session with her where she was speaking to her parishioners and convincing them about the ways that she was dealing with the traumas that they had experienced. And I found it tremendously powerful and instructive about the respect for the oral history subject and the way that they live in different sets of times and places simultaneously. Um, that piece, for Henry anyway, was the key to her ministry, is that she was able to tap into that complicated, multi-layered sense of self that the people who worshiped with her brought to the table. And so even though her church was removed from her by the church authorities after she had built it into a massive movement, she continued to just build these religious movements over the remainder of her life. And so it was an extraordinary thing to be able to write the first formal history of her life and to include her words in that. That piece then led me into my dissertation where I interviewed people who were displaced from their homes, whose lives had been destroyed by environmental racism. Um, in fact, it got so hard for me, I'd say in the first phases of my career, that I was internalizing so much of the pain through using oral history that I haven't done a lot of it since then. Like the power of doing oral testimony with folks, you've got to really have your own tools as a scholar or artist to kind of go through it. And so in graphic history, just as one example, and again, I'll put the link in the chat. Um, there's a particular page that I'm actually astonished we're able to get into the schools, but I do think it's key to the work in the graphic novel. It shows people struggling with poverty, addiction, and gun violence. It's just one page, but we deal with it in three panels, even though each one could be their own book. And people come away from reading that page and they just kind of have to sit with it. So a lot of people can't get past it as they go through the book because it's triggering memories of their pieces of their lives that they don't want to grapple with or have avoided grappling with. And so that trauma piece, the art tells most of the story. Like I don't have to go through and write a novel about what it is to suffer gun violence or what it is to suffer addiction. Although you have extraordinary pieces of art like The Wire or like Homicide that deal with that. And so by tapping into all of that quickly, it slows down the reading. I find that folks stop and kind of have to consider what they're experiencing in each panel. And so I'm very careful about how we go about doing that, and that there's a different way that the words or the images will shape someone's memory and experience. There are two pieces that I've never talked about before that I want to just kind of put on the record here. Is in doing this with comics, as I mentioned, I've worked with some extraordinary artists, and they've reinvented my life in some really profound ways. And I would say Rupa Dasgupta to Tim Fielder at the top of those lists. Um, they led me to work by David Mack, who did a Daredevil series for Marvel Comics, and in particular, the Daredevil's character's encounter with Echo on a question of kind of disability, blindness, and deafness, and how people find each other and start to heal or struggle to heal through their connection. So the David Mack stories, much more the Daredevil than some of the other stuff with the female ninja that he did, but those things had deep impact and continued to shape lots of artists and writers. And the other is in straight literatures, China Miéville, who's pioneered this work out of London called The New Weird. And so he's done a number of books. What at the top of the list is probably The Scar, but also Perdido Street Station. They're all about senses of disability and limitation, either emotional or physical. and the ways that people struggle with their flaws and injuries and how they carry them with them and rebuild themselves and try to find new strength and new love and new connection. So I would say between David Mack, China Miéville, just as artists I've only come to recently, their impact on some of the most important people in my life has shown me different ways that people use all these tools to deal with trauma. And so I'll close by saying this. I did a book, just won a major award 2 years ago called Illmatic Consequences. And it's an academic book, but built around all these topics about how do we actually use all the different tools that we have to try and be our fullest and best selves. And so at the core of the book is Stacey Robinson's art, uh, the one of the defining artists of Afrofuturism, along with John Jennings, did the work with Black Kirby. But he essentially invents Nas as a surrealist figure through his lyrics, in defining hip hop and redefining hip hop over time. But then we spin out from the experience of Nas and hip hop to understand critical race theory, to understand the debates around diversity, equity, inclusion, to deal with white nationalism in global context, and then ultimately to come to the idea of Afrofuturist design and how do we create fuller, wholer, healthier communities together. And so Illmatic Consequences is I'm glad to say has been received as a way of blending art and multiple forms of logic so that we can actually escape the kind of bounds of modernity, the kind of legacy of slavery and segregation. So yeah, there's so much happening. I'm so glad for the way Amy said that. Um, but how do we need new tools. We ultimately need new tools to grapple with the fullness of human experience. And that's where I think this work is taking us.
I'll just say for my class, I think it's an interesting question, Jimena, because I think even talking about comics and trauma basically talks about the fact that they are more serious than most people realize. I mean, the fact that we have to sort of give people a heads up. Because I do think that there is a perception that somehow they are simplistic when in fact there is like this exceptional emotional nuance in relaying these experiences visually, you know? One of the things I've been lucky to be able to do is if I'm able, I always try to have a comic creator come to my class and talk about their work, or also show students interviews or listen to a podcast. Again, the creators describing their own work in their own words. One of the recent books that we do read in the classroom is Kate Beaton's Ducks, which, you know, award winning and I think exceptional and important for so many regards. It's important in terms of labor history, you know, describing her experience working in resource extraction in the oil and gas industry in Western Canada. There's very little history about frontline worker experience. But one of the things, of course, she talks about is also the experience of gender and her own experience, lived experiences going through sexual harassment and sexual assault. But of course, that is a very so that's something we talk about going into the book, but I also talk about the way that Kate Beaton chooses to display it visually, which is almost by absence. And so I think that, and when we talk about that, we also make sure I use interviews from Kate Beaton talking about her own work in her own words, because I do think that it's a lot that we're asking of students, especially maybe students who thought that they were taking a class that was going to be fun because comic books are fun. And I think it's always a bit of a surprise when they start to think about the sort of visual aspects. In my class, their final project is they pick a topic in history that they think does deserve more attention or is underrepresented, underreported. We talk about the fact that it could be a personal family history too, especially if it's contextualized in a larger historical event. So maybe they wanted to talk about their family's experience coming as refugees, living through wartime, but then situating it in the larger thing. And there have been some really personal stories that have come out of that. And I do think there there's almost no right way to do it, but I think the best thing we can do as instructors or facilitators is acknowledge the emotional weight of what we're dealing with. And one of the things I try to also disclose to the students is that I am realizing and grappling with issues within my own profession, things that, we haven't always been on the right side of these discussions, and that I also don't have all the answers, that, I'm trying to tell them some of what I know to be best practices, but that I really want to learn from them, because there's a limit. None of us are going to have the lived experiences of all of our students. And I think trying to create the classrooms in which they do feel like it is more of a conversation and a dialogue. And also, I do think this is the great potential of public history in really acknowledging the fact that history is not neutral. History is not, impersonal. History, especially visual history, there is a weight and a responsibility to that I don't think we've talked about for a very long time. And one of the historians that personally has informed a lot of my work is Carlos Hill's work. Working as a Black historian in the South and talking about the history of lynching. And I want to also point out Carlos Hill was actually a historical consultant on Ryan Coogler's Sinners, which is the coolest thing ever, and also such an important work. But he talks a lot about this idea of historical responsibility, that when we're talking about these subjects, like, we have a responsibility to, our students, the people listening to what we're talking about, but also we have a responsibility to the people who've lived through this history that we're talking about. And I think that just doesn't get acknowledged enough. So, especially with visual history, I think that has to be just this ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Walter and Amy. And that's so important, especially now for the people who live in the United States, that you know that that's has been such a difficult thing to keep doing. So, I mean, but that's another conversation. I have a, I have a last question. So I encourage the people from the audience, if you have questions, that would be, what challenges do you still face today in sustaining and sharing projects that connect comics and memory, social injustice, those kinds of things? And after that, I have a question for Walter.
Oh, so I want Amy to get as close to the last word as she possibly can, because she really was key to make this connection for us today. Um, so yeah, this challenge. So I've had to talk a lot with people about the distinction between what the past is, what memory is, and what history is. And so this notion that there's all this past, there's everything that happened before now, but very little of it gets caught with memory. Like that we're all kind of caught in our space, and even negotiating collective memory is really difficult, and talking about shared experience. But history is a tiny sliver of that. Like when you talk about written record and what gets preserved in a way that professionals can come back and evaluate it, it's a tiny, tiny little piece of everything else that occurs. And so when we get to this notion of a challenge, it's what happened with the middle schoolers, is that after they got over, the idea that Kanye wasn't in the book, they were like, well, what about the last 20 years? And I was like, so we're going to do volume 2 about the more recent stuff. But historians, my training is like, you got to be really careful about trying to say what you're going to define as history when folks are still alive. Did a class on digital history with some students about a year ago, and how we started with this idea of, when did you get your first mobile phone? When did you get your first Facebook account? How do you start to measure these senses of your connection to the world beyond your family that begins to define you individually? And so for folks in their 20s, on average, there's folks who break it, but like you're talking about a decade of what they kind of recall and use to shape their choices on a day-to-day basis. They're not going to remember all the stuff when they're 3, 4, 5 years old, and be able to actually, like, some stuff with flash, but even that is fragmented. So that notion of what can we remember, and I take that word remember really seriously, like break it into its constituent parts. How do we remember, right? What do we stitch back together to call whole? Um, that's the challenge. That is the thing. Toni Morrison writes very eloquently about it. That we're just trying to craft something that's a usable or a useful past, and that's its own kind of charged political term. For me, it's much more about Sankofa and that's become the defining concept for my work out of West Africa and Haile Gerima's film Sankofa is how do we look back and look forward simultaneously? How do we conceive of ourselves not just as we are today, but as we were and as we might what may yet be? And so that sense of transcendence is been a Jiminy Cricket on my shoulder for a very long time. A sense of consciousness that it's not just now, it's not just yesterday, it's not just tomorrow, it's all of it. And so, and it's even beyond my personal thing. I've done a lot of work with comic artists on transcendence of time, like the Holy Bible button like comic, but like that thing about getting people to see themselves beyond what's most immediate. That's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I mean, one thing that probably sort of, I think, surprised me is, in doing this research, I realized so much of my research is really about how people think about history. And I think that this is something that public history offers such an important opportunity for all history, is to think about the historical past, as you so well put, Walter. It's not a past, it's very much the past and the present impact each other so much. Like, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate is so much of our understandings of the past are based on our perceptions in the present, like our particular lived experiences, the schooling that we've gone through, and that impacts our perceptions of the past in a way that also creates kind of its own, imagined country. And that can be very detrimental because I think when people are like, that doesn't allow space for this, or this didn't happen because I wasn't taught it, or comics aren't real history or this or that. And then they start to excise certain things from the record or don't even allow space for those things in the record. I mean, one thing that, Dr. Carol Tilley has talked a lot about with not just her work on Wortham, but, she talks so much about how in the 1950s, like 95% of all kids were reading comics. Like this is this universal experience of childhood in a particular time and place that most people don't even know happened. They sort of think that comic book reading was somehow marginal, when in fact this was such a shared experience that we now sort of are like, no, that didn't really happen. And you're like, but no, it did happen. And it's sort of that sort of resistance to accept that to me has been both interesting and frightening all at once, because you're like, if people are finding this so reticent to think about, like, what other gaps in the historical record are they not allowing space for because of their perceptions of what the past might be, or acceptable forms of telling history too. And so I think that that's kind of a challenge, but an opportunity too, especially I think for public history. And I think also having these conversations on an international level, huge thanks to you, Jimena, especially for doing these explorers talks, because I think the more of us, especially in different, national settings, are sort of also talking about these common challenges and opportunities, it allows us to sort of envision maybe some enhanced way of talking about history on a global scale that I do think is needed.
Thank you, Walter and Amy. And there's that's my last question, but I after your introductions, there's something I'm very curious about Walter's work, and it's the history of ISIS. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why it was blasphemy and all that thing that happened there?
Oh yeah, dignity, divinity. Um, it was a huge leap at a very difficult time in my life. I had been a kind of associate provost and overseeing a bunch of major grants at a small college, and my parents became quite ill. I had to go, and actually, my younger sister almost died. It was just crazy, and so I didn't get much institutional support. I had to leave that role because there were so many things that needed to move forward, and took a job as an adjunct at a local small school, and then got a couple of part-time jobs. I literally had to commute from Buffalo, New York to Orlando, Florida on like a weekly basis. And so doing like three or four jobs. And in the midst of that, wanted to do a project that had nothing to do with like, oh yeah, we're going to give you academic points for this text. And that's what became the Dignity and Divinity comic. I found this artist is Jibba Anderson. And I was like, listen, I'm sick of the kind of patriarchy and sexism that I am seeing. I want to say this was 2012, 2013, and we were seeing backlash against Obama. And I was like, I'm disgusted. I think it was a lot of the stuff around Hillary Clinton that were driving me up the wall. And I was like, okay, well, in Christian theology, this whole thing that men have to be priests and women have to be nuns. And I wanted to disconnect all of that. And so it wasn't the first thing. Like I targeted the kind of the Eve story first to kind of be like, yeah, yes, that link is good for for dignity and divinity. There's a free version on my academia page though. So if folks you don't have to buy it. It's been out too long. You can just get the free one on academia.edu. But the piece when I was thinking through, okay, what if Mary had a daughter? And then how do I play with the actual name of that daughter? I had to go back to Nile Valley civilization. I went back to not just the Egyptology and the archaeology, but a lot of the theory around kind of Upper Nile civilization and the role of kind of folks who are modern day Sudanese in the idea of the dynasties of the ancient world. And so I had done a lot of work. My mentor is Magan Keita at Villanova University, and he is a medieval Africanist. He studies the role of Africans in Europe and the rise of the early Christian church, Catholic Church in Europe. And so he looks at guys like Saint Maurice. He looks at Africans in pre-Islamic Arab societies. And so these complications about the way that we read race back into the past were really familiar with me. And so that's what drove me to look at, okay, if we're going to have a woman savior born to Mary, I like the phonetic similarity to Jesus by using Isis. I like literally the fact that I comes before J in English letters. So we could play Isis as a name that actually seems to come before this ideal of a man savior. So like there were a lot of layers even then as I was just playing with the idea, and I wanted to cause trouble. I wanted to cause trouble. I wanted to take a lot of the really nasty conceptual debates around art and art history that are excluded from normal professional historical discourse. I wanted to bring that to the fore. And so to do that, I had thought about a few years earlier, I had a real conflict with an Egyptologist at another institution. And that sense of that ancient world having really strong racial hierarchies, that the rise of Europe could be read back across thousands of years. I would say that's the root of why I wanted people to look more closely at ISIS as a historical figure and the role of East Africa in the idea of human civilization.
Thank you, Walter. And Amy, I know you're going to hate this question, but when can we read your published work?
I do have, I want to give a great shout out to also to my colleague, Christine Gunderman. We have a edited issue of Graphic History, which was a special issue for International Public History that came out last December. So I do have an article in that, which is teaching history with comic books, opportunities for public history. And there's also in that special edited issue, we have an introduction about the potentials of graphic history and public history. There's also a really great roundtable I dropped in the chat on graphic medicine as public history. But in terms of my dissertation, I'm writing that now. So hopefully folks should be able to read that in published form in the next little bit. I am currently working on looking a little bit more in the archival record, especially for the history of reading. And that's something I hope will come out soon, maybe in an article format. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Walter and Amy. This has been really, really, really amazing. I really appreciate you taking your time on a Saturday morning, Black Friday weekend to take time and share all this with us. So if anybody has comments, doubts, criticism, it's now or never. This video is going to be shared on social media, and I will send a copy to you also for you to have in your records. We're having all kinds of compliments. Uh, Thank you. Really great. Thank you much for your progress. And um, I mean, thank you again. Nice to hear from you. Thank you. So all kinds of thank yous and appreciation. And again, thank you so much for sharing this family time with
Yeah.
us.
Well, thank you for organizing, Jimena, as always. So.